Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this week's announcement is for the 60s. This week we're going to be reading from our textbook, our main textbook, so The Age of Great Dreams. Last week we were just reading from the Purple Book, the 60s book. This week we're back to our textbook and we're reading Chapter 7, The War Within. So we are talking about A Nation at War, I believe is the name of the chapter. We're going to be talking largely about the home front during the war and how the home front in ways shapes the government's policy in dealing with citizens at home, how the home front also sort of reshapes the discussion of the war in terms of the anti-war movement. We're also going to talk about how the war was fought in Vietnam and the ramifications for the nature of that conflict for the Vietnamese people and the American soldiers that fought that war. Of course, the Vietnam War, by 1968, we see the publication. The publication of this actually comes out in 1969, but in 1968, during the Tet Offensive, of course, there was a massive human atrocity that occurred, the so-called My Lai Massacre, in which American soldiers, led by Lieutenant William Calley, went on a rampage in a Vietnamese village and killed several hundred civilians. And of course, this was a product of the war. This, as you would note from watching the documentary last week, this absolutely was not the only time that American soldiers had killed civilians during Vietnam. Vietnam was a very frustrating conflict. The war was fought very close to villages. And of course, the primary enemy, the Viet Cong, was a guerrilla. And the guerrillas did not wear uniforms. They were not always easy to identify. And as a result of this, the lines between combatant and non-combatant in Vietnam were often blurred. And this resulted in a significant amount of civilian casualties. It even amounted in the Vietnam War for soldiers with the so-called mantra that if it's dead, it's VC, meaning Viet Cong. During Vietnam, there was an idea that the way you measured success, the United States wasn't taking land. They weren't seizing cities. They weren't gaining territory and holding territory. Instead, the military approach to Vietnam was based on what is called search and destroy at the time, which was the idea that you would send out your soldiers into the field. They would engage the enemy, and then they would call in airstrikes that would bring an overwhelming amount of force on the enemy. The idea was that you'd search out the enemy and you would destroy the enemy. And so as a result of that, success in Vietnam became based on the kill count. It became based on the idea that the more Viet Cong or NVA that you're killing, the North Vietnamese Army is NVA, the more of those that you're killing, the more successful you are. And the idea would be that you would ultimately kill so many of the enemy that they would be unable to support or replenish their operations, and they would have to sign a peace agreement. They would give up, effectively. It was a very, very flawed approach to waging a war. Nobody knew when the point was where the enemy's breaking point would be found. Nobody knew how many Viet Cong or North Vietnamese Army individuals you had to kill. Nobody knew. So the United States continued to escalate more and more bombs, more and more troops, more and more destruction, kind of trying to seek out this like imaginary breaking point. Well, the product for soldiers is a very frustrating conflict. You're fighting in a war where you don't hold any front lines, and so as a result of that, you have soldiers going and fighting and dying in an area, and then leaving the area, and then returning and fighting and dying in the same area. Very, very frustrating reality. You have soldiers that are fighting in a conflict where it seems like the civilians are as much of your enemy. This is how American soldiers perceived it, that your civilian was as much of an enemy as a combatant. And so as a result of that, the way they measured success was through killing the Vietnamese. And ultimately, the notion, the kill count, the notion that if it's dead, it's VC, was a testament to the blurring of the line between civilians and combatant, and the extent to which the American policy in Vietnam carried very devastating consequences to the civilians in Vietnam, who were oftentimes killed during this war. And as a result of that, of course, their death was used to sort of inflate the body count. If it was dead, it was VC. You added it to the checklist. We killed lots of the Viet Cong. Whether it was, a woman or an old man or something like this, or a person like this, that wasn't as significant. If it was dead, it was VC. And that was a testament to sort of the flawed notion of attrition that was being used in Vietnam, that was obsessed with the body count, obsessed with the idea that you would be successful when you killed a certain amount of the enemy, that they would be unable to sort of replenish their forces there. And so there became an obsession with the body count in Vietnam, and this led to atrocities. The worst atrocity that we know of course, was the My Lai massacre, but there were many other. During My Lai, several hundred civilians, women, children, old men, were killed execution style by forces under the command of Colonel Ernest Medina and, of course, Lieutenant William Calley. But, of course, there were numerous smaller cases. As you heard from the documentary that we watched, there were numerous smaller cases of civilians being killed as a product of the nature of this war and also of the shortcomings and flaws in the American military approach to fighting that war. So I have a lecture this week. It's on the anti-war movement and the Cultural Revolution in the United States. So we're going to be talking not only about the war in Vietnam and how that war affects the soldiers and the Vietnamese people, we're also going to talk a lot about the home front and how the Vietnam War spurns the anti-war movement in the United States, how the government reacts to that, and what that means for the United States. And of course, we're going to be talking about that for the next several weeks as well. So please do watch my lecture on the anti-war movement and the Cultural Revolution. I go into much greater depth than the book does on this, so please watch that. It'll help you when it comes to the weekly discussion. Also, I know some of you probably are interested in this, we are going to get into the counterculture movement in the United States. And I'm sure a lot of you are like, there's so much great music during the 60s. Why haven't we listened to music yet? It is coming. Next week, I have an entire counterculture special for you. And we are going to be listening to amazing music in subsequent weeks. So don't worry. The great music of the 60s, which I'm sure a lot of you are interested in, is coming. And we're going to talk about music and how music is engaging in the political discourse of the time. So that's coming in the next week. So don't worry, that's coming up. We have to do this first, though, okay? The factoid for this week is this. Remember, send me the factoid no later than Wednesday by midnight. Get your bonus point added to a test score at the end of the term. The factoid is this. At the beginning of the 1970s, leaked from a Defense Department employee named Daniel Ellsberg was a report on Vietnam that had been put together by the Defense Department under the leadership of Robert S. McNamara. He was Secretary of State. This document, of course, ultimately became known as the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were highly significant because the Pentagon Papers basically undermined everything that the United States had been doing in terms of Vietnam, because this was an internal report created by the Defense Department. It was an evaluation of what the United States has been doing at home and abroad with respect to Vietnam. And it wasn't intended to be for public consumption. But when it was released, first to the New York Times, and then the Washington Post, of course, really explodes the story, taking the story to a next level, publishing the largest volume of the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers, and of course Richard Nixon was president at that time, and we're going to talk about Nixon in subsequent weeks as well. Don't worry, we have much to discuss with respect to Richard Nixon. We're going to take this class into the 70s here in these last weeks. But the Pentagon Papers revealed really the extent to which the United States government during the Vietnam War had been misleading the American public, had been, in many cases, lying to the American public, had been surveilling the American public, had continued things like the bombing of Vietnam even after it knew that the bombing wasn't working, that it had been trying to cover up stories related to things like the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And so the fact of this week is the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers and their revelations about really the U.S. government misleading the American people about the Vietnam War and misleading themselves about the Vietnam War and conveying really to the American people ultimately the lesson that, we kind of knew as a country, the United States kind of knew that it was making mistakes in Vietnam, and it was unable to sort of check itself to those mistakes. It was unable to recognize the situation and make the right decision. As well, of course, misleading the American public. And so the Pentagon Papers in the early 70s, when it came out, became an absolutely huge political issue. And it really fueled a lot of distrust amongst the American people. It fueled a lot of distrust in the United States government because the United States government had been clearly misleading the public. And of course, that would continue even on another level during the time of Richard Nixon. But the Pentagon Papers showed that the United States was misleading the American public. It was misleading the American public about how successful the war was. It was misleading the American public with respects to numerous types of things. And so as a result of this, it really sowed the seeds for a great deal of distrust in the American government. So the factoid for this week, long announcement, I apologize. The factoid for this week is the Pentagon Papers. The revelations about the failures internally in the government, the revelations about the failures of U.S. policies in Vietnam, and the extent to which the United States had misled the American people about the Vietnam War. All right, everyone, let's have a great week. I will see you in the discussion forum. Watch those lectures. We also have a speech this week by Martin Luther King Jr. That's part of our discussion forum. I'd really like to see everybody watch that and engage that. It's a really powerful speech. It actually kind of gives you, chills when you listen to it. Very powerful speech from one of the greatest speakers of our time. So be sure to watch that too. Let's have a great week, everyone.